Hello, everyone. Thank you, Nancy. Glad you came out on a snowy night. And I also want to say hello to my students if they're watching. You still have homework tomorrow. Now, I was trained as a scientist. I cloned my first gene at 16. Now, I dedicated a large portion of my life to science and understanding. But unknown to me, actually, I was also being formally trained. I was being formally trained to be a robot. So drama and personal emotion had to fall to the background. Now, I recall when I first started teaching my second year, I was working on a chemistry activity with some of my students, and I was walking around facilitating. And I noticed one of my students show up to my front door late. So I'm like, here we go again. So I walk over to the front door, and I'm going, what happened? He gives me this pain look. He doesn't say much. Then he finally tells me, he's like, mister, I got into a fight in the stairwell. Now, I'm taken aback by this because actually this kid is pretty low-key. He's very chill. So I'm wondering, how did this fight happen? Again, I asked him that question, and he said nothing, and he just showed me more pain. And I was like, okay, just grab a seat by the front. When he finally grabbed that seat, sadly, he had been stabbed. So I immediately tell one of my students, go grab a dean in the hallway. The dean arrives. I was like, can you please escort this kid to the nurse? And once you get there, call an ambulance as soon as possible. Now, this is 2003, so I didn't have a cell phone on me at the time. And I'm going to admit something here tonight, too. I was kind of glad I didn't have a cell phone because I didn't want to make that call. And the one thing I didn't want to do is alarm my students. But the most important thing I didn't want to do was disrupt the norms in my classroom. Now, that's a little heartless, and I've been called cold, but I like things to be consistent in class. So tonight, I'm going to talk about a cycle that was consistent for me for most of my life until it wasn't, and that's the cell cycle. And I'm going to talk about how it shaped me both personally and professionally throughout my career. I don't see the clicker. Oh, well. Did you take the clicker? Oh, fantastic. Sorry. Now, the cell cycle allows us to be the kind, curious, mistake-prone people you see in the audience, or this handsome guy you see here in Mexico. It gives us that midsection that sometimes needs a little bit of a touch-up. Or those toned muscles we had in high school. I remember those days. And even better, that dewy skin and radiant hair that some of us haven't seen since we were infants. So when we were babies developing in the womb, the cell cycle allows our organs to develop and our limbs and digits to grow. But what happens when that cell cycle goes wrong? It could be that you have an overexpression of cyclin D. It could be that the RB gene no longer functions. Or it could be simply that P53 no longer applies the brakes, so tumors just grow out of control. Now, thinking about this all can lead to cancer. And I've been teaching a unit on cancer for several years to my students. And normally my students want to get into their personal stories, and like a good robot, I'm like, let's not go there. Let's try to avoid that. And again, you could think of me being heartless or cold, but I feel like in my classroom, if a personal story gets in the way of learning, then maybe I'm not doing my job as a teacher. So therefore, when I think about those stories, I think about crying, a lot of snotty noses, people blubbering, and I don't think that's a place I want to be. Now, I get why my students want to talk about cancer, because it affects about 38% of us in this room. It's also the second leading cause of death in the United States after cardiovascular disease. And for me, cancer became quite personal in 2014. Because I became part of the 38%. I was diagnosed with cancer. Now, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, what am I going to do? I can't live the life I had before. I have cancer. And I was thinking about as a teacher, how am I going to be the teacher I was before this diagnosis? Because all I can think about is how afraid I am and how much I'm wondering, how is this going to turn out for me? And as I thought about it, I felt to myself, all right, just get rational, things will get better. But being rational didn't make my emotional state any better. And to top it all off, that same year too, I was also asked to do the 2014 Fall Functions address. And I'm thinking to myself, oh no, I just been diagnosed with cancer, and now they're asking me to get in front of a room about 2,000 people and talk about, teaching. But I did it, and I'm glad I did it. Just like tonight, even though I'm scared to say this, that I'm a cancer survivor, I'm glad I'm here. Because for me, I didn't want to live a life of fear anymore, and I kept thinking to myself, even though I've been diagnosed with cancer, I got to push on. And also, thinking about tonight when I decided to do this, I'm like, maybe someone can learn from errors that happened in my life. Because cancer is a unique disease. It can erase all the boundaries you've created for yourself and cause you to break cycles that you've always lived through. So as I proceeded and tried to get myself together, a friend of mine told me, well, maybe there's a book for you. I was like, well, what book is that? And she says, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Now, at first I was like, a book about someone dying for cancer is the book for me? I was like, oh, okay. And I laughed too because I was like, all right, I'll buy it. And I read it. And while I was reading it, I cried a lot. A lot. But the funny thing is, as I read the book, there was a lot of positivity coming out of her story. And in that positivity, I was like, you know what? I can gain courage too to embrace my feelings. So as I read more and more, I was like, this is the book. This is going to be it for me. But then I said to myself, wait a minute, I have to see students in the fall. And yeah, my internal life is going fantastic. But how am I going to teach a unit on cancer? And more importantly, how am I going to face my students? So I thought to myself, all right, because if I get in the front of the room and start talking about cancer, I may start crying. So how am I going to get around this? Because again, I'm a good robot. So I decided to use this book to tell my story. And the funny thing is, after deciding that and allowing this book to come to my classroom, things got a little bit more interesting for me. Because I took another step, and I said, you know what? Let's allow more personal stories to come into the classroom. And that chaos and that emotion that I thought would totally disrupt my class, it did. A lot of the activities that we start sometimes don't get finished because the kids are telling me about their stories, and then I start getting teary, and then they get teary, and then it gets a little emotional, but we have tons of Kleenex, so it's okay. And what became in my classroom that I thought was going to be a total disaster, it actually made my classroom so much more richer. And it's not because I'm smarter, and I'm definitely probably not much better at teaching content, but what it allowed me to do in my classroom is share their stories and bring in some human compassion and a whole lot of empathy. And for me, that says so much more sometimes than their Regent scores or how they did on my last test. Because when I think about teaching, I think about the fact that I want my students to leave my room being compassionate, kind, and loving people. Because at the end of the day, they may forget chemistry the following year, and they definitely may forget the cell cycle that I tried to teach them, but they will not forget the compassion I showed them. And I hope they don't forget that I loved every single one of them. So thank you.